the most basic thing I can do. And then right line result dot. What? Result was result dot to string. I'm just showing this inline string expansion so I can make the Java people jealous.
You make it as JavaScript, make it look like XSLT.
You're cursing now. So let's see what happens. Well, that's nice. Can't resolve reference to the profile patient. So supposedly the default resolver that a validator has cannot actually locate the specification.zip. Didn't we have that yesterday at the connected contracts too? Maybe. So this is where you start real coding. Where is my project actually?
You don't have to pass it in as a setting. Make your resolver and pass it in.
Well, I could do var resolver is new directory. What is that thing called? Yeah, directory source. Oh, you. And then pass a hard path to where this gets in the output. Maybe I should do that. This is console F6.
Will it load zip files as well?
So there's another one. There's a resolver 2 is the new. Actually, you're right. Thanks for warning me. This would work because this checks a directory for a directory with separate structure definitions, and what we want was the new zip source. And I can pass it a path to the zip. So I should probably do that and then figure out why it doesn't work out of the box. It depends on whether you're .NET Core or whatever, it will deploy those files in different locations, so it's always well, you know, I'm going to
check the properties for the specification zip, you will get the directory.
that's what I was looking for, yeah. I was like, where is that?
This is coding under pressure.
Yeah.
It's code off.
Yeah, here we go.
We should have.
See it puts it somewhere.
We should have James doing this.
Yeah.
We should be typing and racing.
Next year we expect that.
The coding race.
And then we'll put you in there now.
So .NET Core puts it, the new package manager puts it somewhere in my NuGet store somewhere where of course the thing could never have found it.
Huh? Yeah, it'll be deployed at the bottom.
I didn't want to do that.
Okay, so that
But they shouldn't set it, yeah.
Yeah, but it's not static. You should remove new statements.
I'm sorry.
I think it's static. You have to remove the new statement.
No, I can do this. This is what I want. So I can say the resolver is resolver. There's also a static validation settings of default, but that's what I want to change. So let's see if that fixes it. If it doesn't,
Yeah. breakpoint.
Yeah, there's a breakpoint there. We don't really need it yet. Phew.
Yay.
Success. That was boring though. I mean, success. Breaking it, actually breaking it is pretty hard. So that's the stuff from code. But what's more interesting, I've got a way more elaborate example in my GitHub. So this is github.com/Kramer, and if you go there, you'll find that I have a repository called FHIR validation demo. This is a GitHub repository that contains a C# code example that does all of this and way more. In fact, what I've done is I've written up a Windows application that allows you to just run this from the desktop. So it's easy to experiment with profiles and instances, and you can just run it. And it has quite a nice user interface, but in doing so, it shows also all of the features of the validator. So just clone this repository and look at the code, and this will be the best documentation you currently have. I think Happy will have better documentation, will win that one. Well, we're going to see. What I didn't really know about GitHub, I mean, this is the kind of feature my colleague Vadim told me, is that now you can make binary releases. I didn't know. So what I did is I actually also compiled the source and created 2 binary releases in the same repository. So you can just download the zip and start working with it. I have it running here. So now I realized one thing I didn't do is have a demo mode on it, so it increases the font. Beginner mistake. But you can see here that I have with me here a structure definition patient IK that actually constrains patient a little bit more. It demands a patient identifier. What I did do when I started this tool, I pointed this to a directory here. This is within the presentation, so you get these files. When the files are sent to you after DevDays, you get a zip with all this stuff, I hope. And there is this structure definition. So what I'm doing is I can configure here a directory source. So it will look at this path, and whatever structure definitions are in there will override whatever is in the basic core definition set. So in this directory, which is in my Dropbox, and then here, we're on Friday, structure definition 101. Here it is. Oh, this does Ctrl+ slightly. You can see it has a differential here which says patient.identifier.use is turned off. So that's probably why I get the error. So I'm lazy. I don't want to change my instance. I'm going to change my structure definition. Reload the definitions, so validate. And now it's success, yay, without changing the instance, but changing the profile, that's what I did. So this is way easier, you can play with this. If you have lots of errors, which you won't normally have, you can filter this and so on. And you can even, and this is the important checkbox here, let it regenerate snapshots. So you were seeing my structure definition, it had only a differential. It will run the snapshot generator as well. So the code to this is available, and you can look at how I combine all the bits and pieces. And finally, if you're not into Windows, we built the same validator into simplifier.net. So what I did here is I uploaded this structure definition that we just saw in my directory. I uploaded it to simplifier. So as you can see here, I make identifier mandatory and then put use to 0. And this is indeed +++. Let's see what happens when I plus this. Oh, it scales pretty well. Patient IK, here is the canonical URL. So what I did here is I said I create a new share. Well, so the share on simplifier is just like a scratch pad where I can dump an instance. And somewhere, otherwise I have to type it. Well, I could. But I just dumped the patient here, and I see I need to add this. HSM.org /FHIR. Yay, that will work. So you see here the profile reference. Both James and I have been talking about this, but here you see it now in code. This patient on the meta references that profile. So test resource, well, whatever, 314. I do like pi, what is the name? Create. And now you see that on Simplifier I get a validate button here. And I press that. And we get the same, luckily the same error message. Instance count for patient identifier use is 1, which is not within the specified kernel to 0 to 0. So I've shown you 3 ways, by code, in this window application, or in Simplifier to start experimenting with it. See if I can get back to where I was before. So when you play with this, you can as well press edit here too. Let's see, edit, and I can edit inline if you wanted. Here the differential. So I could do the same thing here, and instead of correcting my instance, correct the profile, and you should have exactly the same thing. Oh, yeah. Save. Yay, no issues. So 3 ways to do it, and obviously we also integrate the validator into Christian's Fonk server. It's all the same validator, so it will consistently do the same thing wrong or the same thing correct. And that's the scary thing, we're talking about it, James, of setting this to strict and always putting it on in your web server. You'll be sure to get emails, people saying, I'm pretty sure this is valid. Oh yeah, this is a mistake in my web server. So now what do we do? Well, switch off the validator? Yeah. I guess you can show more or less the same tools, or no, you're going hardcore. You're going to do this by invoking with Postman something on the server, right?
Sure, why not?
Yeah. What tools are available to run the Java validator? Can you say something?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of what's available for, get this out of here. Go somewhere. So I mean, in terms of ability to run the Java validator, I mean, there's no, what's going on here? We definitely don't have any nice UIs of the same sort that AWeb just showed. But I mean, naturally, you can always run it in code. The other option we've always got is the FHIR demo, or the happy test server. Certainly, you can use the validate endpoint there to use the same validation code that's in. And I'm going to show you an example of that in a moment. Before we get to that, I think what I was thinking I would do, I'll do kind of the roughly the equivalent thing to what AWeb just did, which is quickly code up something to show how this works. My screen is flickering in the weirdest way.
Yeah.
Oh, look at that. Weird. I'm going to try and not be distracted. That is the strangest thing.
Oh, so it's not only
yeah, it's on here too. That's weird. I feel like I'm back at the bar last night. Anyhow, so what I've done, I've created a little sort of quick start project here, just to avoid you guys having to watch me, create the skeleton of a project. This is your standard Maven project. I've created it, I've given it a couple of dependencies. So we've got FHIR base, we've got FHIR validation, which is the library with the validation stuff. I've given it the DSTU3 structures as well as the DSTU3 validation resources. And just in case we need it, I've added the schematron library as well as a simple logging implementation into that. So of course, let's watch me live do this. I'm going to use encounter just to be different from out.
There's more ways to break, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Encounter requires status, so I like it for demonstrations of the validator. All I'm going to do to this thing is add an identifier to it, and I'm just going to give it a system. And that is all I'm going to do to that thing. So if I want to validate that, of course, the first thing I do is I create a context. Oops, I try and spell that correctly. I will ask it for a validator. So let's ask it for a validator. So the first thing let's do, let's run it with schema and schematron. So as I was saying before, if we don't give the thing any modules, we just plain validate what we want. We will pass that in, we will get back a result. And all I'm going to do is spit out the operation outcome. So I will ask it for a parser, I will tell it I want to pretty print, and I will encode the resource that we get back from that thing. I should probably do this on more than one line. There we go. So we ask the result for an operation outcome, and then all I'm going to do in this giant line of text is ask for a parser, tell it to pretty print, and then encode that out. So I will run that, cross my fingers, and hope that it works. Out it goes, it starts up the context, and thinks a little bit, and there we go, out it comes. Is that, can I make that bigger? Cool. So how does that look? We've got an operation outcome, it says error processing, and of course we've got that horribly cryptic error that comes out of schema and schematron, which says expected identifier or expected status. So that's a simple example using the schema and schematron. A little bit bigger, hopefully everyone can see. Let's make this a little bit more interesting by using the profile validator. So the way that we do that, as I was showing before, is we ask for an instance of FHIR instance validator. This is a funny little gotcha. There are, of course, 3 FHIR instance validators, one for each version of the specification. We don't want the R4 one. We don't want the 2, which used to be called just instance. We want BST3 because that was the version of the model that I chose to use. So I will give that guy a name. And what I will now need to do is register with it at least one instance of profile validation support module.set validation support. All I'm going to do is I'm going to give it that default profile validation support. That's the one that just looks in the core specification. The last thing I need to do is register the module with the validator. So register validator module. I will do that. And just for fun, I am also going to register the schema and schematron, which means that both of those things are going to run. Schema-based validator. And we will register schematron as well. So we have got this thing set up so that it is running 3 different modules. It's running the schema, it's running the schematron, and it's running the instance validator or the profile validator. So we're now going to run it with all 3 of those things. And again, cross our fingers, and of course, I screwed something up.
Yeah, I think your outcome is still the old one.
Is it?
Or no?
No, I think that should be okay. No, the issue is these guys want a FHIR context in their constructor. I think it is happy with me. Good. Let's run that again. It's actually going very well for a live coding demo. My goodness. Yeah, no kidding. So that ran again, and we have. So this is not what I would have expected, actually.
Yeah, you're not running a new validator.
Yeah. Let's go back to your outcome is still the old.
You're running your old validator, not your.
There we go. Well, duh. Thank you. That's what I get for saying this was going well. Amazing. So what I'm expecting is to see both errors, the schema one as well as the profile one, and assuming, okay, so let's look at everything that just happened there, because there's a couple of interesting things in the logs. I mean, first off, the context validates that it is starting up. The next thing we see here, so that default profile validation support, you will see it doing 3 things. When it starts up, it basically goes through and loads up profile resources, profile types, and profile others. These are all the base definitions that are sort of bundled in that default structures. A common gotcha when you're sort of using the validator, if you see these 3 lines in your logs more than one time, like you want to see those 3 things happen once because you're loading that up. If you see it happening every time you're validating, then you're being incredibly wasteful because you're basically processing and parsing all of these things for every single validation, which means you're going to end up taking much more time than you need to. So that means you're probably not reusing an instance of default profile validation support for whatever you're doing. So I know this from experience. I've had terrible performance problems and realized it was because of exactly that. So that's something I like to mention. And then we come up and we run the validator. So again, we've got this content development encounter is not complete. But we've also got an error that comes from the profile validator, and that is this one. Profile encounter, so this is the base profile for the encounter resource, and encounter.status minimum required equals 1, but only found 0. So the profile validator gives you error messages that are vastly more pleasant than the schema validator. They usually make sense, which is in contrast to the schema validator and what it spits out. So that's quite nice. And we've also got one other thing, identifier.system must be an absolute reference, not a local reference. That's a little bit cryptic, but what it's getting at there, of course, is that I had given it a system of AAA, which is not actually a valid URI for the identifier system. So, and it's flagging that. So that is an example of running the validator with all of its fancy modules. I don't know that there's more than, yes.
Yeah, one question. So you mentioned these loading structure definitions in Plasma. I had the same problem. But from my idea, how do you solve that? Do you cache then your validator, or how do you deal with that?
Oh, so essentially, yeah, if you've got that same problem where you're constantly reloading, I mean, really all you need to do is, however you're designing your system, you know, if you've got a class that's sort of holding all of this stuff, just make sure that your default profile validation support, what you really want to be doing is putting that in a field somewhere. So I mean, what I would probably do, making this real for this class, is bring that up here and keep it in a static variable. And as long as I'm just always reusing that one instance of default profile validation support, we're all good.
But, so going back to, I've got my own ID that I just ran, so I would use a different validation support class then?
Yeah, so the way you will do that, the validation support modules, where did I declare that guy? Here it is right here. The validation support, oh yeah, of course I put it up there. There are a bunch of implementations of this thing. There's the chain, there's pre-populated, and there's default that I've imported, but there is also one coming that will add, that will be basically IG validation. It's IG pack validation support. So you will just use one of those instead.
So I'll keep bugging you every day until
it's A-okay. I actually would probably appreciate the reminder because I completely forgot about it until a couple of weeks ago, and it's half written, so that's useless. The one last thing I'm going to show, this will be probably deeply hilarious. I'm going to try and show you a call against the FHIR server. I could use Postman, but just to be super hardcore about this, I'm going to try and do it from the command line using curl. Just
show off.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, hilariously, I've already done some of this. Oops. It's almost guaranteed I'm going to screw this up in some way. So we're going to pass in a little resource that I'm going to completely handcraft on the command line. So we're going to pass in a content type header telling us this is going to be JSON content. We are doing a post. We are going to do that to the following URL: http://firtest.uhn.ca/base dstu3 /encounter/validate. And if you're ever trying to do this, I don't know why you would ever be trying to do this on the command line like I'm doing, but I've done this before and I always make the same mistake. You need to escape the $ and validate. If you don't do that, you get the most cryptic error message back that you will ever get. So that is a major gotcha for doing that. And I will pass in some content. Let's create a little resource. Resource type. We'll make it an encounter. And I am just going to give it one attribute of foo true. And now I'm going to cross my fingers. If I get this right on the first try, oh man, that will be cool. I totally did. Amazing. So what we get back, of course, is an operation outcome. The operation outcome has a narrative, which is really disgusting to look at, but more importantly, it's got two issues it's detected. One is this unrecognized property foo, and that was found at /encounter, and the other one is that we are missing the status minimum required, but only found 0. So there's an example of validating against the base URL. Yes?
The validate operation, does that store anything or just validate?
No, so the validate operation, all it does is it sends it to the server, runs the validator, and returns the response with no saving allowed. One thing I didn't mention, so validate the operation, I mean, of course, it's defined in the FHIR specification. It's well worth looking at because it does have some neat properties. You can actually tell it, I want you to validate this, for instance, as an update to an existing resource, and then it will check, is this, you know, is this still valid for that resource? Which on the test server, there's no business rules there, so that doesn't make much sense. But in a real server, that might actually make sense. You can test for delete, for instance. So if you try and do a validate for delete, what it's actually doing there is not so much validating the resource, but validating that the delete operation would not cause constraint issues where, you know, you'd actually be blocked from deleting it because somebody else depends on or links to that resource. There's some neat stuff you can do with it, actually. Those are just they're parameters to the validate operation. And there's a few others. You can say validate against a specific profile and things like that as well. So there's a bunch of neat stuff in there.
So if I post my custom structure definitions to that server, will it?
Absolutely. Yes, so that's a common pattern as well. If you've got a structure definition, you can upload it to the server, and then if you try and validate a resource that declares it conforms to that your structure definition, it will validate against that. And if you just try and upload a resource that declares that it profile, that it validates, it will actually validate against that profile. It's not going to reject it.
The canonical URL that's in there, even though okay.
Correct. There we go. So that concludes programming with curl. I think we are. Good.